Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today what we thought we'd do is update our tier list. It has been 2 weeks since the release of the latest Rush Duel box in Heavy Strike Excavator, as well as the fact we did have some skill rebalancing and some changes to the limit and restricted list, which means it's time for an update. So, this is last format's tier list. This is kind of where we had everything. This is basically the tier list that we had going into the WCQ. We did have Machines as a solo tier 1, Noodles were a very close second best deck, performing very well. Then we had Aggro and then Cyburst, which hadn't quite found its footing yet, but after the WCQ, this deck really did show itself to be one of the stronger decks in the game. I think we did bump this up into tier 1. And then we had the other decks that were good, but couldn't quite break into those top 2 tiers. The first being Royal Rebels, because they really struggled against the Noodles. Overlord for basically a similar problem. They could not really deal with the Noodles, as well as Overlord had a secondary issue of negate attack now being in every single deck, meant that its boss monster main win condition felt a little bit more lackluster because everyone had an out to it. Then Blue Eyes is a deck that having to run 7 high level monsters always does feel a little bit bricky and therefore can lead to some really awkward games. Then there's Harpies, which basically feels a little bit like worse Machines in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. And then the 7's Axel Road, which again gets hurt by the slime and negate attack meta. And as for our rogue decks, these decks were decks that were like, they were getting some tops, but they weren't really doing particularly well, and they had some okay matchups against some of the decks above, but not a great one into all of them. So we took this, and then we did update it when we did get the leaks for the new decks that were coming out. So this was our updated tier list prediction of where we thought everything would be in this meta. So after the WCQ, obviously we've bumped Cyburst up to the second best deck. Then after the absolute destruction of Noodles due to the limit 3 of extra spice, as well as the skill now only being once per duel, at least the part that lets you add a body back from the grave to hand, this deck is seeing next to no play now. Because of that, the decks that it hard countered now get to come straight back into the meta. Royal Rebels is in a fantastic position right now because every one of these decks basically has to commit a lot of attack mode monsters in order to really do anything. The only real exception to that is going to be the Mirror Innovator, because itself can be the only monster you have face up in the field and then pierce over defense position monsters. And then Cyburst is also a deck that can get away with this, just because yugioh itself counts as one monster, but it's basically the same premise, right? If you get out of Doom Metal, you'll still destroy the yugioh, which is every monster your opponent controls, and get those direct attacks in. Overlord as well has seen a little bit of an increase in play, but not as much as we might have liked. And that is because, again, its main terrible matchup has been nerfed, as well as the 2 best decks in the game right now are no longer allowed to use negate attack, which means Overlord should be able to get in and finish off those decks a little bit easier. As for the decks we predicted would do quite well, there is Plants, which we did predict this deck might actually be able to break into tier 2, but has been a little bit underwhelming. There is Worms, which again has been performing okay, but realistically hasn't really stood out. And then the 2 decks that actually did start standing out are the Buster Blader and the Vulcan. These decks actually did a little bit better than expected. But let's go and take a look at the data so I can actually show you what I'm talking about. So here we have the results of every tournament that's taken place since the release of Heavy Strike Excavator. As you can see by these lovely big blue sections on these charts, Machine is quite dominant right now. And as we go up to the table, we can see that Machine has 5 out of 7 tournament wins. So very dominant. We can see that they have 12 top 4 spots, which is more than double any other deck, 19 top 8 slots, which again is more than double any other deck, and thus has really been the outlier and the high performer of this meta so far. Second up, we have Cyburst, which has only won 1 tournament, but has still had 5 top 4 placings, which again is more than double any other deck on this list. Top 8s has also got 7, which isn't quite double any other deck, but it's getting some decent representation, just not anywhere near as much as Machine. Then Royal Rebels, as we predicted, this deck has been showing up. Now, these numbers are still a bit low, but every other deck in the format that isn't Machine and Cyburst is seeing quite low representation overall. So, it's still arguably the 3rd best deck just based on the results, but I still think it's probably the 3rd best deck just based on mechanics as well. And then the big shocker was Vulcan. Vulcan has really surprised everyone. I think most people looked at the box, saw the skill, and went, okay, Vulcan's going to be this like aggro beatdown deck. And I remember in my latest tier list video, I did mention that I think Vulcan would be a rogue deck, but if players could work out some sort of gimmicky burn strategy, it could be quite powerful, and players have done exactly that. Vulcan players have been burning their opponents to death, stacking as many burn spells and traps as they can, and if they just find the maximum as well as all of their burn damage, they seem to be able to close out games rather quickly, so Vulcan has actually been doing quite well. The other outlier is Thunder. Now, Thunder hasn't been putting out crazy results, but it's been doing okay. I think Thunder on its own is actually just a reasonably okay deck. With the addition of Card Devastation, it will allow the Thunder deck to have one big push turn, which it does seem is enough to allow it to win some games. So Thunder is doing quite well. Then we have Overlord, which again is a little bit lower than we thought it would be. We were really expecting this deck to be a bit higher up, but if we compare it, Vulcan, Rebels, Thunder, and Overlord all have the same number of top 2 spots. They're all quite similar in numbers across the board, so I guess you could make an argument these should all be on the same tier, but we'll talk about the tier placings in a little bit. Then we have SAR, which did actually manage to win a tournament, but as we can see here, that tournament is the only time it is top 4'd or top 8'd, so this might be a bit of an outlier, but this does just go to show that maybe with the nerf to negate attack not being able to be played in Machine and Cyberse, which are the most popular decks, maybe that does open the way for SAR to come in and bully those decks. Since this does mean the only card that can really stop SAR from OTKing you now is the Slime. Buster Blader has also been doing quite well. Other than Vulcan, it has been outperforming the other new decks. And then we can see Worm right beneath it, which has had a lot more representation, but hasn't been able to convert those into top 4 positions, unlike Buster Blader. Then Resonance has been seeing very little play. A Red Eyes deck did manage to see a little bit of play, and Bubble Error has also managed to break into a top 8. So there are a lot of different decks on here, but as you might have noticed, it is very top-ended with most players still playing the machines, at least the players that are converting. So this method does look like it's going to be quite machine-focused and machine-dominant. So going back over to the tier list, we can start with our machine deck. Now, the machine deck is still very, very powerful. As we've seen from the data, it is very, very dominant right now, and I think there is an argument to make this the solo tier 1 deck again. But I think a lot of the people bringing Machine are people that have been playing it for a very long time. Obviously, the deck is reasonably easy to pilot. The boss monster in Mirror Innovator does a lot for the deck. And in a lot of ways, I do feel like Machine is kind of the new aggro. It's very comfortable to play. And with the new box being a little bit underwhelming, I think a lot of players decided to skip it and just basically keep playing Machines again and again and again. So I do think Machines is still a very, very powerful deck. I don't necessarily think it should be solo tier 1. Personally. Then there's Cyberse, another very, very powerful deck. This deck can build a board arguably quicker than any other deck. Using its skill, Maximum Ragnarok, you're able to get out your tribute monsters a little bit easier, and thanks to Chaos Femtron, you're also able to plus as well as find extra bodies, which could be tribute monsters in themselves. So quite a common opening turn would be summon out a Chaos Femtron, summon out any other Cyberse monster, use the skill, target both of them, sacrifice the card that isn't Chaos Femtron to summon out a boss monster. Chaos Femtron's effect is now live because we have a Cyberse in the graveyard. Use its effect, grab another card to hand, either that could be another tribute body or it could just be another tribute monster. Then we tribute over our Chaos Femtron, summon out another boss monster, and then we still have that extra card in hand that we can still summon out. And if that was a Chaos Femtron, for example, we could even grab another card to hand. So there is a lot you can do with this deck, as well as the fact that you can stack debuffs. You can use the skill Maximum Ragnarok to weaken your opponent by 800, and then use your Receptacle Mani to weaken that monster even more, and just get in for a ton of damage, and then after all of that, you can still fall back on the maximum. So this deck still has a lot going for it, and is still a bit of a powerhouse. Next up, we have our Royal Rebels. Now, this deck hasn't been performing quite as well as we were expecting it to, so I am going to drop it down into tier 2. I think this deck is still a tier 1 level deck, but if it's not seeing those results and it's not converting in the same kind of way, I think it is fair to bring it down to tier 2, even though I do think this is a tier 1 powered deck, but for now, we're going to put it in tier 2. This deck basically, like we previously said, had one horrid matchup in the Noodles, and with that deck nerfed, this deck is basically primed to run rampant, although we haven't been seeing that quite so much. And one of the big reasons for that is machines can play around Rebels reasonably well. You're able to just basically sit on your Mirror Innovator and not ever commit, or should I say overcommit, into a Doom Metal by having multiple monsters face-up attack, in which case your opponent has to rely on finding something along the lines of a stop defense to flip your guys up to actually get a good Doom Metal push in. So I think as long as Machines is doing very, very well, Royal Rebels aren't going to be bad, but they're not going to be this overwhelming meta threat that they potentially could be. Then there is the Magnum Overlord deck, and this deck is still very strong. I think this deck can get a bit frustrating because it can just steal games out of nowhere and just pull wins out where other decks couldn't, and it does seem a little bit unfair at times, but when it's not exactly summoning the maximum, this deck can feel a little bit lackluster. But with, again, the nerfs to the top 2 decks in the game not being able to run the negate attack anymore, and the deck's worst matchup in Noodles gone, Magnum Overlord in theory should be in a fantastic position to really burst onto the stage and be able to take a lot of wins from the stronger decks. And then there's Aggro, which is an interesting one. Aggro is a deck that I think a lot of people don't like because it's very boring, it's very unga bunga. And even though the deck still on paper is quite good, we're not really seeing it played pretty much at all. So I still think Aggro is probably a tier 2 deck, but I think we are going to bump it down to tier 3 just because, again, it's not seeing that representation, and this is supposed to be a representative tier list of the current format, and if we're not seeing it in the format, well, he's going to at least get a penalty and go down to tier 3. Then we have Blue Eyes White Dragon. Blue Eyes is a bit of a weird deck. It did recently just get announced that it was going to get a skill buff, but that buff doesn't really seem to help the deck in any meaningful way. This deck's primary issue is that you are forced to run 7 high-level monsters, which is basically Brick City. We don't want to be running that many high-level monsters because we're going to open a lot of those in our opening hand and just be completely bricked up and not be able to fix it, and it does get a little bit awkward. So this deck is still good. It still has very good bodies. It can spam out 2500s, which is really good. It's decent at popping monsters as well. It has a lot going for it, but it still struggles to beat the set 3 pass, so that's why it has an over-reliance on Torna at the moment, and Torna is not the best option to deal with set 3 pass, it's just the best the deck has. So I think we're going to move this down a bit, because again, it's not really seeing much play at all at the moment. I think Blue Eyes is positioned to come into the meta in quite a big way, but it needs a little bit more support, or the skill needs to be changed in a better way than it is. Then we have Plants. Plants is going to be going all the way to the bottom of Rogue. Plants have done basically nothing. Barely anyone is touching this deck. People that are playing it are losing a lot on it, and people are coping on different cards like Forest and things like Gajumaru to try and make this deck do plays. Now, this deck still can win. It still does have a couple of good matchups, but the skill is very lackluster. The deck already has easy ways to deal with set monsters in the form of Jasmine and Acacia, so it really doesn't need the extra piercing, as well as the fact that extra piercing and those flipping monsters into attack mode are only really relevant if you're ahead, and this deck rarely does seem to find itself in that position. Then we have Worms. Worms is doing okay. I think we probably move Worms down a bit, but Worms are holding their own. We're seeing top 8s with Worms. They're doing fine. They're not really winning anything. They're not crazy, and I think that's because this first wave of support has been a little bit lackluster for them. If they're able to establish their maximum monster, and if they're able to protect it, if they're able to get their deck to 10 or less cards, the deck can really pop off with a giant, really hard to out, piercing boss monster. But if you don't get to that stage, the deck can just fall a bit short. Then there's Harpies, and Harpies is another deck that's going to plumb all the way down to the bottom of tier 3. I'm hesitant to take Harpies down into Rogue, but Harpies does feel like it's not really got any identity anymore. Basically, the main draw of Harpies was the ability to flip your opponent's face down monsters face up, and that way we could have a good way to get to their life points. On top of the fact using the skill, we can boost our attack up to 26 or 31 if we do have the middle piece of our maximum. This allowed us basically to play in 2 different ways. Either we could just sit on one attack position monster, flip one of our opponent's guys face up, attack over it and get nice chip damage in every turn, leave our other monsters in defense. That lets us play around things like the Doom Metal, it lets us play around an overly aggressive deck such as the SAR, and it allows us to conserve our life points while still chipping our opponent down. Or we could just play everything in attack and just swarm the board and get damage in that way. The problem is that Mirror Innovator does all that by itself. The machine deck has a better way to just leave one monster in attack mode and get a load of damage in. It also has better recycling. It can get to way higher attack, as it can get as high as 5500 if combined with the Aim Eagle. So it just feels like Harpies is just a worse version of Mirror Innovator, and that's why it's not really seeing as much play right now. Next up, we have Buster Blader, and Buster Blader is another little surprise hit. It has actually been performing reasonably well. Because it's a warrior deck, we are able to use the Piercing Samurai to have a good way to get some good chunk of damage in. as well as we have another way to plus. It's not quite as good as Chaos Femtron, but the Witness of Dragon Destroyer is still really good to just allow us to have an extra card, and even in rush duels, having extra cards is really, really powerful. Now, the only real negative this deck has is in order to get the Buster Blader or have easy access to it, you have to use the skill, which does mean throwing it into the graveyard as well as a card from your hand, which is quite a steep cost. But the main issue can actually be activating the skill. There are a lot of decks that don't play monsters that have 2300 attack or more, and we cannot activate our skill if our opponent doesn't have a monster with 2300 attack or more, which means Harpies gets to play under it, Magnum Overlord for the most part also gets to play under it, and Seven's Axel Road gets to play under it. So if we're playing against any of these three decks, unless they're maximum summoning, we basically don't have a skill, which is not the best position to be in. So I think we are going to move this a little bit down the tier list, but like it's still a solid tier 3 deck. And then we have Seven's Axel Road. So we've only seen, again, one of these top, but it did win a tournament, and that was piloted by Sora. So this deck's been around since Rush Duel first came to Duel Links. It is a very competent OTK deck, but did see a decline in play as soon as Negate Attack came out and people had easy access to Slime. That basically meant there were 2 cards in the game that stopped these big OTK pushes, which is a similar reason as to why we've seen Psychic basically completely fall off. Both Psychic and Seven's Axel Road basically want to make a giant board and slam into your opponent for as much damage as physically possible, and ideally kill them in 1 or 2 big pushes. With Slime and Negate Attack in the meta, that does stifle that plan a little bit, but with the 2 strongest and most represented decks now unable to use Negate Attack, that means that Seven's Axel Road only really gets stopped by Slime, which is a decent buff to the deck, and does mean it is seeing a little bit more play. And then we'll go down to our rogue decks. So first up, we have Noodles. Noodles is hard to place. I think feasibly, this deck is still fine. It still does have some okay matchups, but it is a shadow of its former self, being unable to run all the limit 3 cards that did make it so strong and did allow it to stall out, as well as not being able to gain the value from the skill, because getting an extra body every turn was really strong, and only getting it once per game is still fine, but it's just nowhere near what it was. Resonance does have a couple of really good matchups. The main draws to this deck is, one, the ability to pop lots and lots of back row. There are a lot of very powerful traps in the game right now, and this is just a really good deck to deal with them, as well as boosting the levels up high enough that you can attack over some specific traps. There are a lot of traps, such as Recital, which do say that your opponent has to have certain leveled monsters, and if your monsters are just way higher level than that, you can ignore them entirely. So, again, not a particularly overwhelming deck, but it does have some niche matchups and some niche interactions that do make it very strong. Then we have Ice Arc, and Ice Arc probably should be bumped up to tier 3. Ice Arc is surprisingly doing okay at the moment. Now, there are some people that are saying Ice Arc is like a crazy powerful deck. It's insane, and I think a lot of that is a bit overblown and overhyped. Ice Arc is basically another one of those decks that can summon out 3 very big guys reasonably easily, and can quite competently make a board of like a 2500, a 3000, and then like a 1200 or something. And because it is a primarily warrior focused deck, you can again run the Piercing Samurai, so it's not bad. But again, the deck does tend to run about 7 high level monsters, which means more often than some other decks, you will just open multiple high level monsters and be unable to play the game. Now, the thing that's really allowed Ice Arc to come into its own is actually the Buster Blader. The Buster Blader support cards have been slotted into the Ice Arc Spectral School deck and has been raising the deck's performance. Now, it's not suddenly winning a load of tournaments, but it's definitely now on our radar as at least a competent deck. And then we have our boy, the Vast Vulcan. Now, if we were following just the data, Vast Vulcan would be up here in tier 2. But Vast Vulcan does have some awkward matchups, as well as if you don't see the maximum, if you're unable to complete the entire maximum, the deck does feel a little bit lackluster. So I think we are going to bump it down to tier 3. We might even put it below aggro. I still think this deck is competent, but I think as players adjust and they learn how to play against it, and people might start putting specific techs to deal with it, because maximum decks are quite prevalent right now. As we can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 is down here, but it's, you know, it's still there. I think people will eventually figure out how to deal with Vulcan, but again, if you do get lucky, you do high roll, Vulcan can be very difficult to deal with. And then there is Thunder, and I think Thunder is going to sit around the same place as Vulcan. They both feel like competent decks, but they don't really feel like they're tier 2 worthy decks in my opinion. They're still fine, they're still strong, they can still win games, especially the Thunder deck, which just feel like it just has a rather generic but impactful strategy. But I don't think they're tier 2 worthy just yet. And then there's Red Eyes, which, I mean, it's definitely going to go above the plants. Red Eyes, realistically, we've only seen one Red Eyes deck perform at all, and it did have quite the easy run. If I recall correctly, it had like a bye, and then it had to play against some of the new decks that people were still testing in the first week. So I'm not really predicting Red Eyes to come back into the meta in a big way. We did see it have a little bit of playability with Blue Eyes, and basically you'd use the Blue Eyes cards or the Blue Eyes Bright Dragons alongside the Red Eyes with the Red Eyes skill, because the Red Eyes skill gave you easier access to the actual legend monster, which meant the Blue Eyes Bright Dragons were online more often. But for now, it's just going to sit in Rogue. And then we have Bubble Error, which is another deck that I think is actually okay. The skill is a little bit lackluster, and the deck did technically get weakened with Negate Attack being put on Limit 2. That now means you can't play Negate Attack as well as both copies of Seahorse Carrier. So this deck is in a bit of a weird position, but it does actually have some interesting matchups. The deck is able to just make a reasonably decent board, and it's just basically there to Unga Bunga beat over what your opponent's got. So it's not actually in a terrible spot. I just don't think it's necessarily a tier 3 deck. And I think that is going to be it for this list. I think I'm quite happy where everything has ended up. We have the 2 tier 1 decks, which I think it goes without saying, these are definitely the 2 strongest decks in the game. Then again, Rebels I think could be in tier 1, but for now we're going to leave it in tier 2. It's definitely top of tier 2 and only barely out of tier 1. Then we have the Magnum Overlord, which again, bottom of tier 2. Aggro, again, is always a weird deck, where this deck will go weeks and weeks and weeks without seeing any play, and then suddenly it'll win a tournament, and you'll be like, aggro just kind of came out of nowhere. And I think a lot of the tools that made the Thunder deck suddenly perform very well could just as easily be put into the aggro deck. The aggro deck has been playing Trigger Drago anyway, so you could just put Card Devastation plus Dragius. Does mean it gains some attack points, and obviously when it attacks twice, you basically double that boost, so as long as you can get all that damage in, that could also be really, really strong. So again, I think this could go up to tier 2, but for now we'll leave it in tier 3. And of the new decks, definitely the Vast Vulcan and the Buster Blader have been the outperformers. So this meta does look a little bit like it's got a clear 4 decks that are better than the others, but realistically, none of these decks are that far behind and could potentially spike up in the future. So that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.